HuHa 2 ha!
Happy Harry's HuHa 2 Patridge!
Hello and welcome to Happy Harry's HuHa 2 How-Tos, Episode 9. By the nines, 'tis Episode 9! And today we're going to be looking at acting, from doing full body poses down to sort of smaller facial details and expressions and things like that. But I think today is a pretty good opportunity for me to break down how the rest of the series is going to play out now that we're quite advanced. We're in episode 9 of 12. Next week we're going to look at lip sync and working with sound. I know that lip sync is something that people have actually asked for quite a long time now. The week after that will be on episode 11, and I'll be looking at visual storytelling, like setting up a character in a scene and where to place your camera and angles and telling a story, you know, through visual means. And then finally, in episode 12, which I'm really looking forward to, I'm going to show you how to bring it all together and make a cartoon from scratch, basically combining everything we've looked at in the series so far. But there's no time to waste today, so let's get on with the lesson and look at acting. Now, before we look at acting in a more intimate way and begin to sort of look at character expressions, we're going to look at acting in a broader sense with character poses and communicating what characters are doing or thinking using their entire body, which is obviously really great if you're trying to tell a story and the camera is further back in the scene, or you need to sort of communicate things, like we say, in a much broader sense. Now, before we get into kind of how poses mean different things and show what the character is feeling, it'll be pretty good, I think, to look at how to draw a good, readable, communicable pose. And to do that, we're going to look at something called the line of action. Now, the line of action is basically a way of roughing out your pose with one line, and that will help to give your character more of a kind of dynamic pose that has a sense of direction and weight to it. And lines of action will typically be very kind of smooth, sort of quick lines that don't have any sort of hard edges or bumps to them. Like, for example, these two last ones here on the right are not lines of action. A line of action will typically be very kind of smooth with no sharp turns. Anyway, that's useless on its own. Where it comes into play is when we can draw a line of action, for example, like so, and then actually begin to kind of plot our character around it. And by building around our line of action, we kind of get a sense that the character is moving forward here and kind of leaning in. And even though every body part doesn't have to rigidly remain to the line, the majority of the body parts, or sort of the ends of the body parts, like for example, his arm here is sort of moving away, but the hand is still kind of following on down the line of action. We're able to sort of give him, like we say, a sense of urgency and motion and direction. Now, you don't have to draw a line of action before your pose. I think it's one of those things that will eventually become second nature to you, and that's kind of how I worked here. Basically, we have a bunch of fairly strong character poses, but because I am working with at least a knowledge of the line of action, we can probably trace the line through each of the poses. For example, we have this kind of punch here that we can trace a very strong line through. And you have kind of varying degrees of that. We have this character reclining here in a kind of sultry way, and his arm is sort of propping up his weight. That's not really part of the line, but the majority of his body and his pose will follow through with that line. Same again with this really angry guy here. That's a pretty strong line. And with this kind of frustrated looking dude here with his back to us. But here we have a bunch of poses without a strong line of action to them, and they look pretty muddled. This guy here is, I think, trying to pose like he's throwing a punch, but it looks more like he's doing an odd dance, and his body doesn't really have a line of action to it. As opposed to this guy here, who looks pretty powerful. This dude here, who's sort of putting his weight on his arm, doesn't really work there for me. This guy here is too broken really in the middle. Looks more like he's in pain rather than he's actually angry. And I have no idea really what's going on with the guy at the end. But one thing I hear animators talk about rather a lot is whether or not a pose works in silhouette. Now, the great thing about silhouette is it kind of disregards all those little details, and if you can tell a story with just black, simple shapes, then definitely you'll be able to tell a story with putting in all those details and colours. So let's see how these guys here will work in silhouette. Pretty good, actually. Not too bad at all. You can still tell this guy here is kind of leaping up with a big punch. We can tell this person here is reclining and propping up their weight with their arm. I think the strongest of the bunch is this guy here, and I think it helps when all the limbs are sort of splayed out like that. You can definitely tell what the character is doing with their body. And the one that has suffered the most out of the bunch is the one at the end here, and maybe that's why he's so upset looking, because he realizes he doesn't quite work as a silhouette. The fact that the hands and sort of arms here are kind of crossing over each other makes the silhouette a little bit weaker. Not that you have to have everything work in silhouette, because we do have the benefit of colours and little details, but it's something important to bear in mind, and there's kind of a little interesting game that I like to play. What the hell is that? Is the name of the game. And what is it, actually? I can't tell, because it looks like it might be a double amputee with no arms who has decided to somehow get somebody to help them stick a feather in their hair, and one leg is a little bit shorter than the other. Now we can tell what this is because, hey, it's a silhouette that's really clearly defined and the pose is strong, and there's also a kind of line of action going on. It's a guy holding a tennis racket. Believe it or not, they were actually the same pose. I know you saw that coming. The one was just turned around to the side, and that is probably all you need to do sometimes to help make your poses stronger and have them read. So it can be kind of nice to do that little test to see whether or not it works in silhouette. Now, good drawing aside, let's talk about poses and how we can act with poses and actually tell a story and communicate what our character is feeling and thinking. To begin with, here we have this kind of happy, confident guy, and we've shown that he's happy and confident without needing a facial expression by having his chest kind of puffed out here. He's doing big, broad movements with his arms, which typically communicate if you're moving in a big way that you have a lot of confidence and you have quite a high regard for yourself. His head is tilted upwards and sort of looking into the sky, which generally looks quite optimistic. And again, he's kind of putting his feet out very sharply and boldly, which kind of communicates that he knows where he's going and he, like we say, has a lot of confidence. Unlike this guy here, who is leaning down and slumping. He looks very dejected and sad, and we've communicated that by kind of having this very droopy pose with the legs. Doesn't look like he particularly cares about supporting his own weight. The head is tilted down, which typically kind of signifies a pretty negative outlook and makes your characters look quite blue. And here with the arms, I've just got them drop and droop pretty lifelessly, which makes the character look like he doesn't even have the willpower to kind of stand upright and support himself and his weight and pull off any kind of pose. He's that down. This guy has a pretty negative pose, but I think it's more fearful. We've got the character drawing the majority of their body back here, which is what people do when they're scared. They kind of wince up and draw away from the action, and his hand here is kind of slightly protective and, again, drawn back. The legs here, he's sort of resting a lot of his weight on the back leg here because he's scared. But this hand is pushed outwards to the front to kind of ward off anything that might come to attack him or scare him or whatever the subject of his sort of terror is. And finally here, we have a guy who's very aggressive and dominant looking. We have him looking down, which might not sound like a dominant thing, but typically if a character sort of puffs themselves up and makes themselves look bigger, they will be looking down upon their enemy or whoever they're kind of encountering. And we have the arms kind of billowed out here, and the legs have a very wide and confident stance, and it's almost like the pose you should adopt if you encounter a bear or some sort of creature in the wilderness. Not that you have a bloody chance against a bear, but, you know, people say, you know, puff out your jacket, make yourself look big. Okay, so we've got some more poses here. We have a pretty confident guy here, not necessarily happy, but he's still confident. This is a slightly more subtle pose than the first one we looked at. His legs are wide apart, again, sort of suggesting confidence. Hand on the hip is a pretty cocky thing to do, and especially with men, actually. With female characters, maybe not so much. But this hand upraised here, I think, again, lends the character a fairly sort of self-important attitude. This dude here looks pretty crafty and sneaky and looks like he might stab you in the back. And we've kind of shown that by having the character crouch and sort of hunker down like this. But he's still probably looking to one side with the expression. We're not going to look at his expression yet, but the hands are kind of curled up into the head, which makes the character look like he's sort of intimately thinking about something and plotting something and planning something. And that is a pretty untrustworthy trait to give your poses. This guy here is very relaxed and lazy, and again we've given him a fairly wide stance, which is pretty confident, but he hasn't really bothered to support the weight of this arm, so it's drooping by his side. And I've got the character leaning back, and I think that this one arm here supporting the weight of the head gives him a really kind of reclining look to his stance, and makes him look like he doesn't really care too much about what other people think of him because he's scratching away and is pretty much in his own world. Finally, we have a character here sort of marching forward in a very determined way, and the way that we've sort of splayed his limbs out quite far, and we have his eyeline set directly in front of him, makes the character look very determined. But he's still performing an action by walking forward, and having your characters emote and express what they're feeling while performing an action, like running or jumping or beating a walrus to death, is where this stuff really comes into play and becomes pretty useful, and we're going to take a look at that now. Okay, so here we have our faceless character again, eating dinner, which is a pretty standard action, and I haven't really imbued this character with any specific emotion, which may work for your scene. Perhaps your character isn't feeling particularly strongly in any particular mood, but here are some examples of this same action imbued with some kind of emotion. Now, this is a subtle change, but here's the character looking a little bit more tense. As you can see, we've kind of made the back straighten up, the shoulders have raised as well, and the arms are sort of sticking straight down and out, which makes the character look a lot more tense and pent up. Now, another thing that I did was have the cutlery here facing straight up, and I can kind of imagine his fists gripping them so tightly that maybe they'd be sort of vibrating a little bit in his hand with anger or sort of tension or whatever it is he's feeling, which is making him look so unnatural. Again, having him look straight out in front of him into the horizon makes the character look preoccupied but not necessarily relaxed. And two, this is pretty subtle, but the character's feet have kind of curled up slightly, like he really cannot let himself go and relax while he's eating dinner. I don't know what's upset him, by the way. Totally up to you to make up that part. Here's something a lot more broad, and it's the character pretty damn happy and relaxed. Hey, he could actually even be drunk. The character's leaning back in his chair. He's sticking this arm out, but he looks pretty carefree. I think those broad movements help to show that he doesn't really mind how he's perceived. We've got this big, broad movement with the arm, sort of, I can imagine he'd do a big sweeping movement upwards to fit the fork into his mouth. His head's leaning back and he's looking up, and you can kind of imagine a self-satisfied look on his face. And I've even got the pinky popping out here, which makes him look extra content. And these feet too are sticking up, which makes the character look very kind of lazy and self-satisfied. Finally, here we have a sad character who obviously is eating a terrible dinner because he's hardly even putting it in his mouth. And I think when you're dealing with actions and acting like this, you have to consider, would the character even be doing the thing that I'm showing them doing? And you may need them to perform the action for the story, but there's a way that they can do it which will communicate what they're feeling. And I can kind of imagine the guy just sort of playing with his food, circling his fork around his plate like that, and looking overall pretty dejected and not stuffing his mouth. But speaking of mouths and everything surrounding it, let's take a look at expressing using your character's face. When creating expressions for your character, the possibilities are fairly endless, although I kind of understand if it doesn't feel that way to begin with. I'd liken it to being able to mix any colour you want out of the three primary colours, red, yellow and blue. On their own, that's not a whole lot of colours, but when you combine them and mix them in interesting ways, you can create almost anything that you could possibly want. To begin with, I'm going to isolate each facial feature by itself and show you what we can do with it. So to start here, we have the brow, and this is a very furrowed brow that I've taken down very low, which creates this kind of angry, concerned look. Of course, the brow can go up equally as high, and again, it kind of pushes the skin up, and which creates little folds here, much like with the furrowed brow. And this creates a much more surprised and more optimistic look, but it can also be used to kind of create a sense of fear and shock as well. And here we've mixed things up a little bit. We've given one eye a very arched high eyebrow, and then one a very low eyebrow, which creates a more quizzical or kind of smart alecky expression. Also, we can have these kind of concave, drooping eyebrows going inward here, which create a sad and dejected look here for our poor character. And while we're on the subject of eyes, I'll talk quickly a bit about eyelids. Here we've got the eyelids drooping down, which create this sort of sleepy, distant look for the character. Although if we were clever with what we did with the rest of the face, they could also be used to create a kind of sultry and alluring look to our character. Probably not this bald guy here, but some character somewhere. And also, if we sort of did something more uneven with the eyelids and had one up and one down, it creates a more kind of whacked out, drunken look to our character. And quickly, while I'm talking about eyelids, I'd like to mention there's a kind of misconception about bottom eyelids. For years, I thought we could move our bottom eyelids, but we kind of can't. It's more the cheek area around our eyelids which create the illusion of a bottom eyelid sort of pushing up like that. So bear that in mind. Not that you really have to worry about it too much. Family Guy breaks that rule all the time. God knows I do. But it's just something to keep in mind. But your cheeks won't move without your mouth moving at the same time. And here we have a big, wide, open grin, which is kind of the universal code for happiness. May not be universal, actually. It might mean something really terrible and insulting on Neptune. But anyway, for our purposes today, this is a pretty good way of showing a character's happy. And as you can see, the corner of the smile is sort of pushing up those cheeks there. Another expression which pushes the cheeks back more than up is the sort of gritted teeth, which can work quite well in an angry or scared expression. Here, the character's jaw has sort of opened up wide and low here, sort of leaving them agape, and the cheeks will be a little bit more hollow because of this, and the sort of eye bags here are a little bit more stretched looking as the mouth is open so wide. Incidentally, it's a good thing to remember that only the bottom jaw will move. It can move up and down and even left to right a little bit, but this sort of top part of the mouth here, this sort of top row of teeth, will stay rock solid. At least in realistic characters. There's no reason you can't completely break the rules like that when you're dealing with animation. Here we have a very closed little mouth, which will work quite well with shock or kind of puzzlement, and that isn't really affecting the contour of the face in any great way because the mouth is so little and tight. And finally, we're going to look at how the direction that the pupils are looking in can also create an effect. Typically, pupils are used in a way to show who or what the character is looking at, so they're more functional and literal. But here, having the character look back can sort of create the effect of them looking over their shoulder, maybe being a little unsure. Here the character is looking up, which has a more kind of optimistic effect on the character's expression. And then you have something like this, which just makes the character look like they have problems. So let's bring all these aspects together and create full facial expressions. Here we've got big, happy, sort of wide eyes and a big, huge, open, grinning mouth, which creates a very overtly happy expression. Here we have kind of the opposite. We've gone with combining the furrowed brow and the open mouth, but done in a sort of more angry style with, rather than the cheeks kind of going up at the corners, they're actually just opening wide and back to create a kind of angry, shouting mouth and angry expression. And here we've combined the sort of sloping, drooping eyebrows and drooping eyelids and the small, almost closed mouth to create a very melancholy appearance for our character. Here we've actually combined a smiling mouth with the sort of angry furrowed brows and the pupils that are staring behind the character to create a sort of sinister, plotting expression for our character. Here we have the big, happy, open eyes, but a sort of worried, open mouth, and that creates a pretty intense look of shock. If we wanted the character to look even more fearful and kind of terrified, then I'd probably go with giving the character those sloping, drooping eyebrows, and now he really looks worried. Here we've combined those worried eyes that we had a minute ago with a smiling open mouth, which creates a kind of relieved look. It also looks like maybe the character is fearful but is trying not to show it. Maybe they're in a situation where they're in front of some big kind of hulking brute and trying to keep their cool. And then finally here we've got the angry eyes, the sort of arching furrowed brow, and the small mouth, which creates a kind of "what?" expression. And that might be how you're feeling now after this week's lesson. But I hope you got something out of it, and next week we're going to be looking at combining, as I say, lip sync and sound. Join me then, folks. Bye-bye!